welcome all of you to the teach-in on nonviolent responses to terrorism. This session this afternoon is part of our reaction, reflection, hopefully inspiration to some activism in light of 9/11. And it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. After they're finished giving their formal remarks, we'll stop for a brief Q&A, and then we're going to engage in some interactive activity. Smithey is an associate professor of sociology at Swarthmore College, where he coordinates our peace and conflict studies program. Lee studies social movements, ethno-political conflict, and nonviolent conflict methods. He has focused most of his work on conflict transformation in Northern Ireland and strategic nonviolent action. In separate projects, he is currently studying repression management in civil resistance and the changing symbolic landscape represented in the wall murals of Belfast. His new book, Unionist, Loyalist, and Conflict Transformation in Northern Ireland, has been published this year by Oxford University Press. He holds a BA in Sociology and Music from Emory and an MA and PhD in Sociology from the University of Texas at Austin. He is the former chair of Peace, War, and Social Conflict section of the American Sociological Association. George Lakey has led 1,500 workshops on 5 continents, led activist projects on local, state, and national levels, and authored 8 books on social change and peace. His first arrest was for a civil rights sit-in, and his most recent was with Earthquaker Action Team and Swarthmore students in their sit-in in a PNC bank in Washington, D.C., opposing mountaintop removal. He has won the Martin Luther King Peace Award and the Giraffe Award for sticking his neck out for the common good. At Swarthmore, he taught a popular course, Nonviolent Response to Terrorism, which was publicly attacked by a right-wing think tank. As an undergraduate, he began his sociology studies at the University of Oslo in Norway and has stayed in close touch with the country's role as a social laboratory for implementing the values of social and economic justice. Lynne Schofield is an assistant professor of statistics. Prior to joining the faculty at Swarthmore, Lynne worked at the National Research Council, National Academies, and as special assistant to the Dean of the College of Education at Temple University. Her research focuses primarily in exploring and developing statistical models to apply to educational and economic policy issues. Lynne is a co-founder of Our Voices Together, an organization that merged with Americans for Informed Democracy in 2008. She is now vice chair of the Board of Americans for Informed Democracy. Lynne holds a PhD in statistics and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University and a BA in mathematics from Swarthmore College. Lynne.
Just because I like being associated with George, one of my classes was a runner-up on that list of classes that George was. George made the top 10 list of one of the most dangerous classes. I was only a runner-up, like I said. The theme of today's teach-in is nonviolent responses to terrorism. And usually I try not to read, and I'll try not to today as well, but forgive me if I attend to some details in my text as we're going. But the theme of today's teach-in is nonviolent responses to terrorism and violence. And after an attack like 9/11, we naturally thought, what do we do? And what do we do now? And our reflexive reaction was, frankly, military intervention. President Bush stood on the pile at Ground Zero, you may recall, and said, they will hear from us soon. We heard phrases like, we have to kill them over there before they come over here. Now, 10 years on, we're still engaged in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. As we know, the Bush administration launched Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7th, 2001, featuring massive air support. And then this was only weeks after the bombing of the World Trade Center. The Bush administration went on to lead a somewhat ragtag coalition of the willing in an invasion on Iraq on the false pretenses of destroying our former partner Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Now, bringing us up to date, in July, we had approximately 150,000 troops in country in Afghanistan, though President Obama is promising to almost have that by next summer. In Iraq, last month, we had about 46,000 U.S. troops in country. That's down from 200,000 at its peak in 2008. And President Obama has just pledged to cut that to 3,000 in the next year, though some hawks in Congress would prefer a number of about 10,000. So we are seeing a kind of process of demilitarization, but these wars did not come cheaply in treasure or human life. And I think it's worth noting some of the casualty statistics that have mounted over the course of the past 10 years. In some of these instances where a range of casualties are mentioned, I'll just say the lower, more conservative estimate. iCasualties.org reports 4,792 coalition deaths in Iraq as of this month. 4,474 of those were U.S. troops. Statistics on civilian war casualties in Iraq are highly debated for a range of methodological reasons, not least of which is the fact that the U.S. military essentially refuses to count civilian deaths. But Iraq Body Count now documents civilian deaths in a range, or at about, on the low end, 102.4 thousand, or 417,000. And it's also worth noting that the International Organization for Migration estimates that 1.6 million Iraqis were internally displaced between 2006 and 2010. So again, the costs have been high, and the picture is also stark in Afghanistan. iCasualties.org reports 2,711 coalition deaths in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2011, as of this month. 1,766 of those were U.S. troops. Civilian deaths are even harder to track in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission and the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan reported that between 2007 to 2010, 8,832 civilians have been killed in the conflict, with civilian deaths increasing each year. And that, of course, doesn't include the figures between 2003 and 2007. Some other reasons, and by the way, I should also point out that the vast majority of these deaths are perpetrated by anti-government elements, so I'm not trying to attribute all those deaths to U.S. forces. Some other research has been conducted into civilian deaths from coalition airstrikes, though gaps in data make it difficult to get a full picture. Professor Mark Harold estimates on the low end, 2,256 Afghan civilians were killed by U.S. and NATO forces between October 7th in 2003, which was the opening of the war, and December 10th, 2001. Nearly the same number of civilians killed on 9/11 in those attacks. Between 2005 and 2008, he estimates on the low end 2,699 civilian deaths. Human Rights Watch estimates that 556 civilians were killed in airstrikes between 2006 and 2008, a much lower estimate. All these numbers to say that 9/11 was immensely costly in terms of human life, and our military response has been even more so. Meanwhile, back at home, the post 9/11 period has been marked by deficit and economic crisis that, according to some economists, is related to our war spending and the military-industrial complex. The Congressional Research Service estimates that the U.S. will have spent almost $802 billion on war expenditures by the end of fiscal year 2011. And when the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz estimated the costs of America's wars in 2008, he and his co-author arrived at a price tag of $3 to $5 trillion, which has only grown since then. And it's not only Stiglitz who is concerned. According to a new poll just released last week by the Program on International Policy Attitudes, quote, 6 in 10 Americans believe that the U.S. weakened its economy by overspending in its responses to the 9/11 attacks, end quote. So all this to say that our military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan have been disastrous by multiple measures. And yet, at the same time, we've seen a proliferation of nonviolent resistance movements around the world over the last century. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, who have a new book out called Why Civil Resistance Works, have constructed the Nonviolent and Violent Conflict Outcomes data set, which includes aggregate data on 323 violent and nonviolent resistance campaigns from 1900 to 2006, so over 100 years worth of data. And they demonstrate in this new book and in a 2008 article in the journal International Security that major nonviolent campaigns have achieved success 53% of the time, compared with 26% for violent resistance campaigns. A Freedom House study of 67 international political transitions from authoritarian or tyrannical systems between 1972 and 2005 found that the presence of cohesive nonviolent civic coalitions had a highly significant effect on the levels of freedom that were established after the transition. Of the 35 fully free countries, according to the Freedom House ratings, if you're familiar with those, after transition, 32 of the 35 had featured grassroots nonviolent resistance. And of course, I think we've all been watching with fascination the Arab Spring over last semester and the summer. I know we had the TV on in my classroom a lot at the very beginning of class, just trying to catch up on the afternoon's news. So here's my challenge to all of us. And it really is a call to begin thinking with me in my classes, outside of my classes, wherever you're willing to sit down and talk about it. To think about, at this particular juncture, 10 years after 9/11, I think we have to ask how strategic nonviolent action can challenge terror, whether it's state terror or non-state terror, such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. There are many, many case studies of effective people power revolutions that have overthrown or reformed authoritarian state regimes. The Philippines, Chile, countries across the Soviet bloc, Egypt, India, we could go on, and in fact, George is going to have the opportunity to introduce a new resource here at Swarthmore that's just been launched, and I'll leave that to him. But we should also be looking for cases in which nonviolent resistance has challenged non-state terror. And let me offer a couple of examples of the kinds of movements and actions I'm thinking of. Take, for example, if I may, the Peace People in Northern Ireland. Some of you, maybe faculty, remember when the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Mairead Corrigan Maguire came to campus in, it was either 2003 or 2004. She was a co-founder of the Peace People movement, and in 1976, during one of the most violent years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Mairead Maguire, Betty Williams, and Kieran McKeown led a popular cross-community challenge to all paramilitaries and the British state to end the armed conflict and for citizens to come together in building a more equitable and inclusive society. Up to 20,000 people at any one particular time, and there were multiple events with tens of thousands of people over the course of 2 to 3 years, came out onto the streets demanding an end to violence. The Troubles did not entirely end as the movement declined in 1978, but remarkably, the violence never returned to its previous levels. Let's also think for a moment about Mexico. In Mexico this year, the poet Javier Sicilia has rallied the public to challenge the government's increasingly extreme drug war policies after his son was tortured, bound, and shot by members of a Mexican drug cartel. Activists cite the 40,000 dead since President Felipe Calderon launched an offensive against drug cartels in December 2006. Now, the movement is actually challenging the state not to squander its legitimacy by becoming increasingly authoritarian. In fact, they've been challenging an act that looks very like the Patriot Act, actually, in Mexico. Instead, the activists want the government to swap its force-based strategy for one attacking the poverty that helps the gangs find recruits, that's the drug cartels, and want the government to root out the official corruption they say has allowed organized crime to grow. So these local militaries have, either directly or indirectly, stood up to both state militaries and non-state paramilitaries, as well as drug cartels. And we've seen how courageous activists in situations of oppression around the world have cleverly learned to manage repression and levy heavy political and economic costs on opponents through nonviolent discipline and careful tactical choice. In short, nonviolent action persists and is sometimes fueled in situations of extreme terror. And given its track record around the world over the past century, I think we have to think about how to refine and expand its use. We may need to develop sensitive forms of support and depend more on fellow citizens around the world to challenge and manage extremism in their own regions. And there will no doubt be challenges. A great deal more training and research in nonviolent resistance needs to be undertaken. Many will undoubtedly face violent repression. We'll have to think about how do we build transnational movements that support and don't undermine local movements challenging terror in their own backyards. How do we avoid merely trading militarism for neoliberal development policies that are to support people power movements but that selectively serve U.S. economic interests? But there are also bound to be some advantages as well. Local movements are more knowledgeable and effective in challenging authoritarianism and extremists on their own turf. We're less likely to tarnish our international reputation around the world. Democracies are more likely to emerge from nonviolent resistance campaigns than from civil wars and great power interventions. And we can channel resources into addressing problems of social and economic justice here in the United States, where I just heard the other day on the radio that 1 in 6 Americans suffer from food insecurity. And if you didn't get the memo, your federal subsidized loans have been X'd as well for all you students out there. So we have a lot more to study. George is going to introduce a new resource that is going to grow over time, and hopefully that many of you will be able to participate in. And I look forward to talking with many of you about these difficult questions as we go forward post 9/11. Thanks.
What would Norway have anything to do with this topic? Some of you are aware that Norway experienced terrorism this summer, but Norway is a very obscure little country tucked off in the northwest of Europe, not exactly mainstream major power kind of country, but I've been interested in it for a long time because I see it as a kind of social laboratory where people get to try things out. And the rest of us can either benefit from those things or not, as we choose. But we get to see them played out over time. Because it was in the 20s and the 30s that Norwegians had a fierce class struggle, escalating, to the point where the resolution in the mid-30s was that the workers and the small farmers took control of the country and set its direction. And that direction has been pretty much maintained ever since the mid-30s. So it's not very often that we can see an experiment engaged in over that amount of time in which people look at themselves as experimenting with measures that can increase equality and peacefulness. So that in UN surveys and other surveys, Norway is regarded as one of the most peaceful societies on earth, and also one of the most egalitarian, equality being one of their major values, and also one of the more open societies that exists in terms of their democratic life. How do you do that? How do you do that? So that's been one of the questions for me, and I gave a faculty lecture a couple of years ago about what I'd found out so far. So when this terrorism came up within their midst in July, I was very keen to see, okay, since they freed themselves up in the 30s to become more experimental in progressive directions, what do they do about terror? Because very often, as we've seen in this country, terror can set back a society. It can scare people into retrenching from any kind of creativity that they might otherwise have. It's hard to be creative when you're scared. And I was just really curious about what the Norwegians would do with that. A guy named Anders Behring Breivik was the guy who decided that Norway was so off course in its willingness to allow Muslims to come into the country, set up mosques, practice their religion, be themselves culturally, that Norway was really sullying its purity, its wonderful heritage of Christian civilization by allowing all this mucking around. And he, I think rightly in a way, decided that the people who were responsible for this terrible act was the Labour Party, because it's been the Labour Party that's been mainly running Norway all this time. And so he decided to set off a major bomb, kind of Oklahoma City kind of bomb, in center city Oslo, where the Prime Minister and the Labour Party apparatus is centered. And then to go to an island which has a youth camp where young leaders of young adults who are going to be the Labour Party leaders of the future probably, were having a summer camp experience, in which summer camp for young adults, of course, being very much about discussions of philosophy and worldview and values and that kind of thing. And this man took enough ammunition and weaponry so that he could, and also dressed in a police uniform in order to look not threatening, and just spent quite a while shooting people one-on-one, and shot almost 70 people that way before he was finally stopped. So that's a disaster for Norway. 77 deaths of a kind of massacre like that is that they have to go way back to World War II days when Nazi Germany occupied Norway to remember anything on that scale. And it was an enormous, enormous shock. I handed out on the handout the list of 8 tools that can be used in trying to shape a nonviolent defense policy for a country, in case a country got interested in doing that. Because what we found when we were doing that course here at Swarthmore, attacked as it was, nevertheless, students loved it. Colleagues shook my hand when they found out we were being attacked for it. And the college was totally, seemed pretty thrilled about it. But anyway, what the students discovered by having this toolbox of 8 tools, and then looking at any given country's situation that is threatened by terror, and using that toolbox to shape a nonviolent defense policy, that they could get pretty far in developing a credible alternative to violence. So I thought you might be interested in seeing that set of 8 tools in order to contextualize Norway's response. Norway's response that I'm looking at right now, just very briefly, is in that resilience one. That is, what is that, about the 4th or 5th on the list? Which has to do with when something's happened. Obviously, they weren't, no, I won't say obviously, but they weren't really expecting this guy to be succeeded by a series of other right-wing extremists who were going to be mowing Norwegians down. So I was particularly interested not in the other tools, but in how do people in a society respond to a shock like that in such a way as not to set themselves back, or not to, which is another thing that's possible, Lee, I think, was alluding to that, not to set up future trouble by the way one responds to the first trouble. And I think that's what the U.S. has done. So what to do? Well, of course, the immediate shock, it was very unclear who did it. People just knew there was this terrorist attack. So a fair number of Norwegians assumed it was a Muslim attacker because that's what's in the air globally. And people who looked like Muslims on the streets in Oslo, some of them got spit on and got hostile reactions with just that assumption. The leadership, though, and this is the crux, I think, of what I can share with you. The leadership saw that they needed to act very quickly to defend core Norwegian values. That is, that the strongest response they could make to terror and shock in their midst was to reassert the values that are core for Norway. And so the Prime Minister, the clergy, the bishops, there's a state church there, a variety of leadership, and they even rented the royal family. I shouldn't say it that way, but the royal family in Norway is not anything like the British one. It's very available to be of use and of service, and so they aren't at all surprised when somebody calls them up and says, "We need you now," and do this, and they most likely will do it. And so they also jumped right into the thing. Later on, they divulged that one of the members of the royal family had a close relative who was among those who was slaughtered in that youth camp. But they decided not to make the thing about them, but to make it about the Norwegian people. So I'd like to, if you can imagine, describe the leadership sort of fanning out, using mass media, but also going out to any place where people were gathered, and there were many gatherings, all saying pretty much the same message, which is what has made us essentially Norwegian is what we must repair to right now. And that is our deep love for democracy, our deep love for openness and for fairness. That's what we're about. And that's what we need to reassert. Jens Stoltenberg, the Prime Minister, he said, the proper answer to violence is more democracy and more openness. Okay, those are the core values. I would say that diversity in Norway, and I've studied this quite a lot, diversity is more of a reached-for value. Have you ever found that in your own life? That there's something you value, but you more often are like reaching for it than you would say it's your core value. It's not necessarily your value in your home, but you really want it. And that's what Norway is like a lot. That is, Norway inherits the white racism that the rest of the world experiences. So Norwegians were building slave ships, back in the day and so on. So it's not like white Norwegians can take a pass with regard to racism, but there has been a commitment on the part of the leadership, and I would say the mainstream of Norway, to fight against white racism and to value diversity and find ways to support diversity. So that's a value that I would say they reached for and tried to elevate it. So even if somebody would say, "Oh, you're not that diversity friendly," they would say, "But we need to be, and we want to be now." It was kind of that sort of statement. And then the other thing, so with regard to the core values and that reached for value, what they did then was develop a kind of stance. The royal family, the crown prince was speaking to 200,000 people. The king was issuing statements from his wherever he was. They are not very much into thrones and things over there. Very unfancy royal family. But anyway, where they were saying all these things, but the style was very aggressive. It was, what would make him think that he could make us retreat from being true Norwegians? It had that kind of, and I think psychologically it was very interesting because they were able to get to, you know how strong defense is as a passion. I'm sure you've all had your defensive moments. And that's the energy that they reached for. We will defend ourselves against this threat to our core values by asserting them ever more strongly. Interesting play on the word defense, or on the attitude and the style of defense. And then finally, the way that they related to their values was to trump one of their probably best known values, which is to be buttoned down, to keep the lid on emotionally. Norwegians tend to be very, very, somebody's referred to them as God's frozen people. Just in terms of their cultural style of expression. And I think it's one of the reasons why they need to be open to more immigration from around the world, to kind of unfreeze the Norwegian style. And I married a Norwegian, so you can accuse me of whatever. But anyway, what was fascinating to me was that they made an exception this time and decided emotional expression is all right. And leadership were shown in public crying. They had the most amazing experience. A single event was 200,000 people in Oslo gathering with flowers all together, crying, supporting each other. 200,000 people out of a city of 600,000. It's 1 in 3 members of the city. So these enormous collective outpourings and the teddy bears and all of that kind of thing that you can imagine, being willing to be emotional. This youth or the youth wing of the Labour Party that was attacked by this terrorist, one of the members of that youth wing was interviewed by CNN. She said, if one man can show so much hate, think how much love we could show standing together. And that then got picked up and quoted over and over by the country's leadership. Okay, well, I think that this, and you can go to YouTube and get some flavor of this Norwegian response, is good news for the rest of us around the world, especially in the US, but other places as well. To me, watching Norway for a long time and then trying to notice global trends as well, Norway is often early in acting out something which is later picked up. I think they're they're one indicator of paradigm shifts that happen globally. And one reason why I think their response in this case supports my guess about the role of Norway and Scandinavians more broadly is the degree of defensiveness found in the right wing in this country to the Norwegian response. There's an op-ed in the New York Times by somebody who was complaining that Norwegians have lost their taste for vengeance. Where's the vengeance? And this is not new, their loss of the taste for vengeance, because their penal system reflects a lack of lust for vengeance. Their penal system is just ridiculous. They don't have the death penalty. That itself is really outrageous. Not only that, the longest term in prison you can get is 21 years in Norway. This terrorist, the most he can get is 21 years. That is ridiculous from the point of view of this right-wing expression, and it just shows how inhuman they're becoming. And I thought that was just a very interesting reaction. The reason the Norwegians do that kind of approach to the penal system is it drops recidivism way down. They have some among the lowest rates of recidivism anywhere in the world because they treat offenders in such a humane way. So they just see the pragmatic payoff. It turns out they're very pragmatic. But to the right wing, some of you may have seen Jon Stewart. How many of you watch Jon Stewart? At least from time to time. A guilty pleasure, right? And some of you may have therefore caught his roundup of the Fox News gang and how terribly upset they were about the way that this terrorist attack was being treated and understood and interpreted in the media. And I think that extreme defense on the right, actually to me, because I'm an old guy, takes me back to the 60s when we had the civil rights movement, and one of the responses in this country in the civil rights movement was increased purchase of guns by white people and increased membership in the NRA, the National Rifle Association, by white people. And I just think it's so interesting to see how a movement led by someone who said, my goal is the beloved community, gets to be so threatening by people who like the good old way that they respond in that way. And so I think we've got something on our hands that's very interesting. A moment in time in which the increasing turbulence and polarization that we see in our society indicates a very deep clash of values. That is, I think you folks who are younger really are going to get to live a life in which you'll get to see a lot of that kind of clash between more progressive values up against the threatened right that will be working like anything, even attacking a Swarthmore course, in order to try to maintain itself. And that will be an exciting place for us to live. One contribution, let's see if I can do this in the right way, that originates right here in Swarthmore is this database, which we hope will feed into, I hope, I'll speak for myself, will feed into this paradigm shift that I think is about and around the globe. That is, people actually having a mirror. The database can be looked at as a mirror, in which people can look in and see, oh my gosh, hey, that's us. We did that. There are cases there from almost all the countries in the world. Put up your hand if you contributed cases to this. This is Swarthmore students, assisted by some students from other institutions who have created this database, 430 cases so far, and counting. There's another research seminar right now that's working on adding another 100 cases to this. These are all cases in which people are up against it in some way and using nonviolent struggle in order to fight their fight. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. These aren't all successful cases. Most of them happen to be, but there are also plenty that don't, because we can learn a lot from things that don't work as well as things that do work. But the hopeful thing, I think, is that for many people, this will be a new look at reality, a view of history that's not simply a view of oppressor following oppressor, but a view in which people fight nonviolently and often succeed in changing their lives. Last thing I'd like to share, a quote from the Norwegian novelist Jo Nesbø. Just want to leave this with you. After the bomb went off, an explosion I felt in my home over a mile away, and reports of the shootings on the island of Utøya came in, I asked my daughter whether she was scared. She replied by quoting something I had once said to her. Yes, but if you're not scared, you can't be brave. So, if there is no road back to how things used to be, to the naive fearlessness of what was untouched, there is a road forward to be brave, to keep on as before, to turn the other cheek as we ask, is that all you've got? To refuse to let fear change the way we build our society. Thank you.
The URL for the database is over on this board over here if anybody's interested in visiting it.
Hi, everyone. As Rebecca said, I'm Lynne, Steuerle Schofield. Some of you might wonder why I'm here. I'm a statistician. I study economic and educational outcomes statistically, but in fact, I'm here to talk about sort of a very personal reaction to 9/11, and that is that my mom was on board the plane that went into the Pentagon. And so I thought that I could kind of counter what Lee and George said today by talking about individual responses that people can have to terrorism. And so I thought I'd actually start with a story about my mom, just to give you a flavor of who she was. Actually, most people think September 11th is the hardest day for me, but they're wrong. September 9th is actually a much worse anniversary, because that is the last day that I saw my mom alive. I had been invited to a party of a friend who lived at the time in Arlington, Virginia, and it wasn't very far from my parents' house in Alexandria, Virginia, where I grew up. So being the good 24-year-old that I was, I, of course, went to the party. And then the next morning, drove over to my mom's house to have brunch with her. And I remember this brunch very, very vividly. To start, we had orange almond salad and corn on the cob, which sounds like a kind of disgusting combination. But the main reason was that my sister was living abroad in Japan, and my father was in Singapore, and so my mom was actually leaving in 2 days to go visit my sister, then meet up with my dad and fly to Thailand. And so she was essentially trying to clean out her fridge. And it was a gorgeous day, much like today and much like September 11th 10 years ago was. So we sat on the back porch and we ate this interesting combination of things, and we talked, as we often did. And the kind of focus of the conversation turned toward my complaints about the fact that I had started yet another new job. This was my third in 2 years after graduating from Swarthmore, and once again, I didn't really like it, and I wasn't really sure where my place in the world was going to be. And I was considering going off to graduate school because I had talked to this guy, some of you might know him, Kai Campbell, who had told me that he thought I actually was smart enough to do math in grad school. And I was telling my mom that I was really unconvinced, that I didn't think I could do the math, and I really didn't think that I could write a whole dissertation. That like 100 to 150 pages seemed overwhelming. A 10-page paper in college had been a cause of quite a lot of angst. And my mom said, and I kind of very well will quote her with her sage advice, she said, "You know, Lynn, a dissertation is like almost any big responsibility in life. It can seem overwhelming if you look at it in its entirety. But if you break it up into little pieces, all of which you know you can accomplish, suddenly it doesn't seem so impossible." Now, I've applied this advice to a lot of areas of my life in the past 10 years, and I suppose you could say this is how I think about how we can counter terrorism. Lee and George have both talked to you about sort of what nations and what societies can do. And their scholarship and life experiences have taught them these valuable lessons. And clearly, as George has shown, learning from what other nations and what other societies have done can be a really useful tool for all of us. And so I think his database is just a really smart idea. And I think it's clear that nations can respond in thoughtful and peaceful ways, and that these methods directly can reduce terrorism. But for me, I sometimes get overwhelmed and discouraged, just like I felt that morning 10 years and 3 days ago, because when I think about responses at societal and national levels, it doesn't empower me particularly very much, particularly when nations and societies don't respond in the way that I think they ought to. And so what I need to do, I think, what all of us need to do, is to take my mom's advice, yet again, she was right, and break it down into what individuals, what you and I, what we specifically can do to counter terrorism in our own way. And I really believe that in the battle against terror, there are few contributions more important than those of ordinary citizens, like all of us in the room, to create a safer, more compassionate world. And there are experts who agree that continued action along these lines has to be part of the long-term solution to global terrorism. There's a guy named Robert Pape who works at the University of Chicago, and he wrote a book called The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. And in that book, I'm quoting him when he says, "An individual can die, only a community can make him a martyr." See, I think terrorist tactics lose their ability to coerce if they lose their ability to recruit. And the messages and the tactics of the bin Ladens, the Al-Qaedas, the Talibans, they can only be powerful only in so much as they are heard and followed. And so our message here must be very different. To start on the home front, we have to send the message that we aren't terrorized. We aren't victims. And I wonder if the way in which the media portrayed this 10-year anniversary, if that really is the message that we sent over the last 2 weeks. Or if we did send the message that we are still victimized, that we still are caught in what happened 10 years ago. I wonder how we could respond in a different way. Our message abroad is that we have to reach out in friendship. We have to support schools, clinics, welcome exchange students into our homes. And if we tear down the walls among communities, then we reduce the ability of terrorists to rely upon those communities as a base of support. So I believe that individuals can be effective at battling terror because I experienced it firsthand. My father and sister, as I said, were overseas when 9/11 occurred, and they couldn't get back to the States because even, if you recall, they sort of boarded down all of the airports for quite a long time. And even when they opened them up nationally, they still didn't open them back up internationally because not everybody internationally was necessarily following all of our US rules that we had suddenly put into place. And what I found is that the community of people that I lived and grew up with, they got on the phones and they immediately started doing exactly what they said that would sort of be against the terrorists. So they reached out, and eventually they found an admiral in the Navy at the Pentagon who worked with our very democratic congressman to get my father and sister on a military transport out of Tokyo into Seattle just so that they could finally make it home. So it took a week for that to happen, but because of the community of people that supported us, I felt that sort of larger ground of community because people-to-people interactions got various people that I never knew involved in it. I also found that we had so much food in our house, we literally filled the entire fridge and freezer in my parents' kitchen, the one in the basement, and then we had to give the food away to food shelters because of what communities, what individuals did in their own response to try to help us in those days that followed. Now, I am a statistician, so I also recognize that my experience is only a sample size of one. So I turn to others to find support for this, right? And this further supporting kind of my individual approach is the research of a guy named Ken Ballin, who works or founded the nonprofit polling group Terror Free Tomorrow. So first I should tell you a little bit about Ken. He's a former prosecuting attorney, US prosecuting attorney, and he essentially has studied in great depth how the US eventually brought down the mob in Chicago. And he believes that essentially the same way that we did that by finally getting people in Chicago to stop supporting the mob is essentially how we can battle terror abroad. And he said, and I'm going to quote kind of for a while, so I apologize for reading, but he's a lot more eloquent than I am. About his research, he was asked to testify before Congress, and he said the following. 6 out of every 10 Pakistanis who have a favorable view towards bin Laden and al-Qaeda said their opinion of America would significantly improve if the US increased educational, medical, and humanitarian aid to Pakistan. In fact, more bin Laden and al-Qaeda supporters said their opinion of the US would improve with such American policies than did non-bin Laden supporters. Later in his talk, and these are polls that he's done across the world, and particularly in areas where there's a lot of terrorism, later in his talk to Congress, he said, if the United States demonstrates that it respects people by helping to make tangible improvements in their daily lives, even the anti-American attitudes of those who have a positive opinion of al-Qaeda are likely to change as well. And we have proof of how effective these changes can be. After a massive tsunami struck Indonesia on December 26, 2004, the United States led an extraordinary international relief effort for the victims. Of course, America dispenses aid to many countries, but the money is normally funneled through governments, and ordinary citizens rarely see or experience the results. America's relief effort in Indonesia, by contrast, consisted of on-the-ground, people-to-people assistance. It was broadcast nonstop on local Indonesian televisions and had a clear American brand. The assistance not only saved lives, but demonstrated to Indonesians that America cared about their well-being. Afterwards, public opinion among Indonesians dramatically swung in favor of the U.S., with 65% of Indonesians expressing a favorable opinion as a direct result of American aid, including 71% of bin Laden supporters. This gain in American reputation was accompanied by a corresponding decline in backing for the perceived symbols of the most radical anti-American views, bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and their local Islamic allies. And Terror Free Tomorrow has conducted surveys in numerous other countries and found similar results. So it's not just the Indonesians, but in fact, whenever we do the humanitarian aid where it's literally people to people, people find that maybe us US people just aren't quite so bad. Quite simply, it's not only much harder to brutalize those who have reached out to you, but building schools or clinics, it represents an alternative vision of how energy and power can be directed. And building community support abroad does two things. First, it discourages those who might otherwise choose terrorism to choose compassion. And second, it isolates the terrorists from their local communities, making their work harder to do. And this is exactly what the US did in order to bring the mob down in Chicago. So to me, all of this suggests that at no point in history has our national security depended as much on our ability to be a respected and integral part of the world community. And when we send a tangible message that we care about others, when we work not just as a nation, but as individuals and communities, we spread goodwill. And that goodwill is an invaluable asset to our national security. I believe the only way to achieve true security is to build a world where conflicts neither justify nor excuse the use of terrorist tactics. A world where no community condones terrorist tactics as a legitimate response to disagreements or differences. In other words, true security comes when we build a safer, more compassionate world. I think each one of us in this room today can help make a positive difference, and George is going to kind of lead, after the question and answer, an opportunity for all of us to think about what we personally can do as we reach out abroad. Because to me, I believe the more we do today, not just as citizens of the US, but as individuals and citizens of the world community, the more likely we will leave the world a better, more secure place for all of us. Thanks.
So we're going to take a few minutes for quick questions or comments. So we're going to move rapidly. Yes?
Thank you for all the speakers. It was wonderful to have the flow, the problem set up, and then a national level solution and a personal level solution. It was just really, really nice to listen to. Thank you. My quick question is with regard to that individual, the power of the individual. I've read really briefly some principles in peace and conflict studies about viewing violence as a disease, as sort of using an epidemiological model, the medical model for the spread of violence. And I don't know if any of you has any kind of expertise. I just read it really briefly in response to actually a film. I guess the director of Hoop Dreams has come out with a new film. And in the description of the film is about people who used to be violent on the streets of Chicago who kind of have the credibility with young people who are now valiant to go back and say, this isn't really your path. And that project is based on this idea that violence is like a disease that spreads, so that it's not about an individual being bad, it's about an individual making poor choice. And if you can take it away from the individual identity and turn it into something, the process that you can stop. So I was just wondering if, in terms of scholarship, the field of peace and conflict studies, if any of you could address that.
Well, I mean, there's a book by Deborah Prothero-Stith about this exactly, and I'm not real familiar with exactly how it works, except that, and I mean, I'm not all that familiar with that book. I just happen to know that she has addressed gun violence from an epidemiological perspective, and so you might be interested in it. And my guess is that there's some great psychological research that melds well with what you were talking about, and when you were just saying there that if you can, remove, essentially criminality from people, that sounds very like a kind of ongoing labeling process that people sort of construct and reconstruct mentalities that are conducive to crime and violence, et cetera, et cetera. So some psychologists could probably comment on that.
And just also, I don't know if you've read Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point. I mean, he talks about social phenomenon as being kind of like contagion, So if you think about that model, that idea of violence being disease, and counter it with the idea of sort of peace being contagious, there might be some interesting directions that we could go, like looking at that, looking at the role of like the mavens and the actors and other artists.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Okay, George.
I'd like you to form groups of 3 or 4. Get together with the people close to you, conveniently to you. Countering terrorism is all about collectivity, getting together. Great. Okay, so do you know each other? Good, good, good. So here are some questions that I would like you to take a couple of seconds for each of you to just allow the question to seep in, and then for you to talk with the people that you've just discovered. Your first thoughts. So this isn't finished dissertation stuff. This is first thoughts. Be spontaneous with the people that you're with. The first thoughts that come to you. These are the 3 questions. What messages from my culture did I grow up with about how to respond to violence against me or near me? I'll repeat it. What messages from my culture did I grow up with about how to respond to violence against me or violence near me? And then, how open am I to considering other options in addition to those that I was told were correct by my culture? How open am I to considering other options in addition to those that I was told were correct ways? And then, what might lead me to consider nonviolent options? What might lead me to consider nonviolent options? So please turn to each other and share whatever spontaneously arises.
So for our closing exercise, I invite you to lift up in 5 words or less your answer or a powerful answer you heard to the third question. What might lead me to consider nonviolent options? We're just going to create a kind of verbal collage.
Well, one of ours, the last thing we said was pragmatism. When it works, and it works well, then we're interested.
Okay, pragmatism. Others?
Role models and support from the community.
Role models and support from the community.
Role playing, so you have some experience with it.
Role playing. Good. Collective memory.
Framing nonviolence as a courageous response.
Framing nonviolent as a courageous response. Good.
Peace education, especially before college.
Peace education, especially before college. We were kind of talking about that too.
Thing that came up with ours was sort of mediation, but the more general thing would be the opportunity to be heard in an open way, to have conflict heard in an open way.
Conflict in an open way. Yes.
I kind of looked at the questions from a very personal point of view as a father of twin 8-year-old boys, and there being conflicts that arises in that family dynamic. And what often stops me from a violent response is the love that I have toward my kids. And if in our societies, if we had an experience of love toward our enemies, love towards our neighbors, love towards those that would do us harm, there would be much less of a pull toward the violent response.
Okay. Expansion of love in our communities.
The active aspect of nonviolence.
Active aspect of nonviolence.
Respect for another.
Respect for the other.
One of the things we talked about was starting meaningful conversations with people from across different cultures.
Okay. Cross-cultural conversations, meaningful conversations.
Say equality.
I didn't hear?
Say equality.
Equality. Okay, I think that's a lot of good food for all of us and inspiration. So will you join with me in thanking this really good panel?